Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we will talk about how to get better at forecasting. My name is Deborah Braquet. I'm Sales and Marketing Manager at Solventure, and today I'm joined by Julian Verstraete, who is a data scientist at Solventure. He will introduce himself a little bit later onwards. Let's just start first with the agenda. So we will first start off with a short introduction on Solventure. Who are we? What do we do? What's our vision? And how do we approach sales and operation processes? Then, of course, we're getting to the topic of today, and that is forecasting. Why is it important to have a good forecasting process? And Julian will share some of his tips and tricks to improve that process. He will illustrate that with a short demonstration of the leading indicator forecasting module, so you get an idea of one of the things that can help you improving your forecast accuracy. After that, we will have a look at what are some possible next steps for you, and then we have some time to answer your questions. So if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to already enter them in the question pane in your webinar screen, and then we will get back to them later. And of course, in the end, you can also post some questions. We will finish with a short ball, and it would be very nice if you all could attend this. This is just to get an idea of what you thought of the webinar, if you have some suggestions, because that can also help us to improve our webinar content for the next time. Okay, let's get started with introducing Solventure. So at Solventure, we're experts in sales and operation processes and supply chain in general. We are based in Belgium and the Netherlands. And we are covering the European region. We closely collaborate with Arqiva. Arqiva is an s&op software which we use in the optimization of s&op processes. They are based in the US and Asia. So together we have a global coverage, let's say. Arqiva this year has been listed as a leader in Gartner Magic Quadrant. Gartner is a leading platform for technology and supply chain software as well, for example. So what is our vision at Solventure? At Solventure, we think that the sales and operations processes should be driven by strategy. And of course, the goal is to create a competitive edge in your supply chain so that you can compete with your competitors. Why do we put so much importance in the strategy? The strategy is something that defines a sales and operation process. If you're, for example, a customer intimate player, then you would, of course, like to provide as good as possible a service to your customers. And this will have its effect on how you arrange your supply chain process. If we look at optimizing a sales and operation process, we look actually at 4 key pillars, which is a process. So if you don't have a good process, it will be hard to achieve your goals. And the process should be leading. So it's not that we think that a tool is the leader in your supply chain process. It's really the process that is first, and the tools can help you, for example, to automate your process, to make it more efficient. And analytics, a third key pillar, can help you make that even better and can help you make the right calculations you need to gain optimal results. Of course, all of this will not work if you don't have educated people running that process. And that is something which we see is often neglected, that the people are actually a very important pillar in this whole process. Communication is important, knowledge is important, And these are also things that we specifically focus on and provide, for example, also trainings on supply chain topics to better help educate people within those supply chains. If we look at the S&OP process, we identify 6 modules or 6 building blocks, let's say, where we start with segmentation. And segmentation should really be driven by your strategy. So you could be asking questions like, which product give me the best margin, but which customers are most important to me? So these are all types of questions that help you in segmenting your product portfolio. So segmentation is a very important step. Then we have, for example, product management. Product management is also a very important one. For example, when new products are introduced, we see that a lot of those products are overstated, so they are over forecasted. And if you don't have the product managers into that S&OP process, it's hard to adjust quickly and efficiently to adjust to the market demand, let's say. So that's why the product management should be a part of your S&OP process. And then, of course, today we're gonna have a closer look at demand and how you can optimize your demand planning. Gillian will later on explain you some of the key things that you should not neglect when you do a forecasting process. But obviously demand also has an impact on the rest of the supply chain or on the rest of the S&OP process, being inventory planning, supply planning, executive S&OP. Now, the ultimate goal is to maximize the ROCE, so the return on capital employed. And to measure this, we use the supply chain triangle, where we try to keep a balance between service, cost, and cash. So as a topic of today, or as the things that I've described in our S&OP process, we of course try to make that a reality at our customers. And on this slide, you can see some of our customers within different industries. So we are active in chemical and process industries. We are active in discrete, automotive, high-tech industries, and we are active in food and CPG. So this is where we try to make an S&OP process a reality. And hopefully some of our customers are also joining today and can acknowledge that. So if we look at demand in specific, there are some specific building blocks that are important in that process. First of all, in a demand planning process, it's quite important to set out the right KPIs. And a very popular or a very common KPI is, of course, forecast accuracy. The more accurate you make a forecast, the more accurate you can manage your inventory, etc. So what we do see is that sometimes the KPIs are not clear, and in the end, this will also lead to that there is no way to steer the forecasting process in the right direction. So that is something very important, is that you measure what you're doing in the demand planning process and that you're able to follow up on that and measure the performance. Another important thing is collaborative forecasting. So it really adds a lot of accuracy if you can include customers in that forecasting process. And of course, also techniques like including external information in the forecasting process can really advance or enhance your forecasting process. So as I said today, Gillian will share some of his experience, some tips, some tricks that can help you improve your forecast accuracy. So I will hand over the word to Gillian.
Okay. So what about me? I've been working for a couple of years already as a data scientist and forecast expert at Solventure. I've been working on projects in leading indicator forecasting and forecast accuracy improvements. I'm currently doing a PhD in operations research, and my research is very applied, and it's put right into the leading indicator software tool. And professionally, my main interests are big data, statistics, and supply chain. So today I'm going to tell you about forecast improvement. The question there is where do we begin? So maybe let's start with the problem statement. And more on that, let's maybe start with a very famous forecast quote. Forecast is always wrong. That's actually a quote that's derived from George Box's quote of that forecast models are always wrong. Why are they always wrong? Because they are approximations from the reality. And when you approximate something, well, it's not realistical to take into account every single behavior. It's not worth a while, and it's basically also impossible. And if you say, okay, the forecast is always wrong, but then a logical follow-up question is, but how wrong? Well, in this webinar, we are not going to talk about forecast accuracy metrics, but generally you want to quantify that, how wrong your forecast actually is. Then, of course, logical follow-up questions are, how can we minimize the wrongness, and what is considered, or how wrong is considered good? The last question is something that I get a lot. Lots of people come to me and say, okay, in my process, we have an average accuracy of 80%, 90%, 95%. Is this good? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. You cannot say yes or no to that question, because it all depends on, well, how good forecastable that specific time series or the group of time series is. In certain situations, an accuracy percentage of 50% will be very good, and in certain situations, an accuracy percentage of 95, 99% will be bad. This brings us then to the problem statement, the forecasters or the demand forecaster's nightmare. As a demand forecaster, you do not have only one SKU that you want to forecast. So generally, there's a lot of SKUs that you need to review and forecast. Lots of demand planners have to manage over 1,000 SKUs. It's not realistic to do this all manual, so there need to be automated procedures on how to forecast those SKUs. Also, in current demand planning practices, well, you apply a certain set of forecasting techniques to a specific pattern. So that's also something you want to automate. And how do you do this? Well, you need certain metrics, and the first of them is, well, the variance in between the forecast demand amounts. This is generally quantified using the coefficient of variation, and moreover the squared coefficient of variation. Here you can see two demand patterns. Don't look too much at the name yet, but you can see the one at the bottom has few demand amount variations. The demand is always in between 9 and 13 units of demand. Whereas the one at the top, it has a lot more fluctuations. You can see the demand ranges from one SKU or one demand to 13, 14 units. So that's a first metric. Second metric is the average demand interval. So the demand or the interval between two periods of demand. So that's then directly the second axis. Right now there are 4 different demand patterns that can be seen. The first one is smooth. So this means, well, it's smooth. So there's not much demand variations, and the period in between demand is basically 0. So there's no periods without any demand. These techniques, generally, they have a very high predictive ability, and there's specialized methods that can really forecast such product groups or products really well. Techniques like exponential smoothing and so on, they are proven to work really well on such patterns. The second demand group is intermittent. So intermittent, you can see, well, the demand amount is somewhat constant, and in between the demands, there's periods without demand. These ones, we call them medium forecastable. Why? Because, of course, the demand amount you can predict quite well, but the period in between demand periods is generally more difficult to predict. For those kind of time series, there's also specialized techniques such as Croston's method that are able to forecast these time series. The two time series at the top, the erratic and the lumpy, so that that's where the demand amount is not or very unstable, and there's either no demand or periods without demand or periods without demand. They are very difficult to forecast. There's no specialized techniques for such methods, so they're very difficult to forecast, and there's no special techniques available. Of course, that's not all that you have to take into account as a demand planner. There can be seasonality present. That's something that is not mentioned yet. So it could be that the demand pattern looks erratic, but actually, if this erraticness is due to seasonality, then it all of a sudden it becomes quite easy to forecast. And then also you have to take into account what is the value of the product. Does it have a lot of sales? Then it might be a more important item. And also it could be that the item in question is very important for a specific customer or an important customer. So then it also becomes important. And this can also be an indicator that maybe you should predict this time series then by using or predict it manually. Can we do something about it? Yes, and that's what I'm going to talk about. It's a 4-step program. The first step is the preparation step. So the data preparation step is the first step of this step is the data preparation and cleaning. So here there's generally 2 topics now that I want to talk about. First one is aggregation of weeks. So when a pattern is, for example, too nervous to forecast on a weekly basis, then it can be a good idea to aggregate this weekly nervousness to a monthly level, so that some of the erraticness is filtered out. Well, this brings a problem, of course, because if you want to aggregate weeks to months, then it's not that every week falls in one month. So you need you need to either split the week according to the month. So maybe if the week changes on a Thursday, then you need to take everything up to Thursday and put it in the first month and then the rest in the second month. But there's actually a better technique to do it. And well, it's called 4-4-5. And in 4-4-5, well, you basically say, okay, I'm just gonna take a shortcut here. I'm gonna attribute my first 4 weeks. I'm going to attribute this to the first month. The next 4, I'm going to attribute to the second month. And then the next 5 weeks, I'm going to attribute to the third month. So for example, in such kind of aggregation method, January will have 4 weeks, February will have 4 weeks, and March will have 5 weeks. Well, is this a problem for your forecast? Because you can say, okay, the week with or the month with 5 weeks, it's going to have a peak. But the answer is no, because if you use a forecasting method that takes into account seasonality, it will just say, okay, March is always a period with more demand. And then afterwards, if you disaggregate the 4-4-5 pattern, then you can just split it over the weeks, but more on that later. Then a second method is actually performing outlier correction. So there can be outliers in your data series, and these generally they have an influence on the demand pattern. There can be due to events which have a positive impact. Examples of this is maybe promotions and acquisitions, for example. They will on general increase your sales. And there's also events that will let your sales drop. There can be, for example, stock outs or the tariffs. I think the trade war is something that will be familiar for a lot of you. And you need to take those into account, and you need to filter out the influence of these events. And why? Well, the reason for this is actually twofold. So these events, they all have an influence on the pattern. And if you want to forecast this without cleaning your data, then you will actually try to forecast the wrong underlying trend, which will lead to a forecast that is even more wrong. The second reason is because if you make a forecast and you see, okay, well, I make the forecast now, but this is of my clean demand. So when we make a forecast and you say, okay, well, in the next month we will do a promotion, then if you in the past did such a similar promotion, for example, here you can see, well, in April there has been a promotion which increased the demand with 50 units. Well, then you can say, okay, if I'm doing for next January, if I'm doing a similar promotion, the forecast should also be augmented with 50 units. The second step is analyzing your demand. I've already briefly explained this in the previous slides. So what do we understand by this? For three things. So first, an investigation of the demand patterns. And generally questions like this are answered. Is there seasonality present? Is there a lot of periods without demand in between demand periods? So that will be influential there. The second one is the variability analysis of the demand. So if the demand changes a lot, then also this will require a specific handling. So that's then more related to the demand amount that I talked about previously. And then the third one is a Pareto analysis on your sales. What do we understand by this Pareto analysis? We want to split our portfolio into three groups. The first one, let's call it Group A, consists of 80% of the sales value, of all items with 80% of the sales value. The second Group B will consist of everything between 80 and 95% of the sales value. And then the last group, the Group C, will be the last 5% of the sales value. And if you look at the pie chart at the bottom, it's the left one, then you can see, well, for the Pareto, of 40% of the SKUs, you actually get 80% of your sales. And moreover, what's also striking is that when you see category C, the last 5% of your product portfolio consists of 40% of the SKUs. So these items, they can be also very expensive to maintain, and generally they can have a really erratic forecast pattern as well. On the right, you can see the graph where the demand is split between all the variant or the different metrics. So you can see the Pareto, the pattern, and the variability. The third point here is the application of two different business or forecasting concepts. The first one is a segmentation approach. So as I already mentioned, you generally want to apply a certain set of forecast techniques depending on the segment. So for example, if your demand pattern is very smooth, then a different set of forecast techniques will be used than when your demand is very erratic. And moreover, of course, if there's seasonality of a clear trend present in the data, then you might want to override these settings and say, okay, if there's seasonality present, then I want to apply, for example, a hold winters method that takes into account seasonality and trends. The second concept here is hierarchical forecasting. And this basically means that you will forecast certain products at multiple levels. And why do we want to do this? Because at different levels, there's different effects playing. Let's maybe illustrate this with an example. So if we want to forecast at the SKU customer level, well, generally the demand pattern, that's a very low level, by the way. So there, the demand pattern will be more erratic, and it will not be as easy to forecast as forecasting on the high level. Forecasting on the high level, the market level, for example. So say, okay, I want to forecast all my product or all my products for a certain product group in a certain market. Well, then this will be less influenced by the individual order influence of a certain customer, for example. And thus there will be clearer influence of the market seasonality and the market trends. However, if you want to say that's not generally the forecast that you can give to production, you cannot say, okay, I want for the entire of Europe, I want 100 units of my product group. You need to specify for them, yeah, I want 5 red ones, or 5 big red ones, and 3 green small ones. So generally, this forecast does have limited applicability. So that's why we actually suggest to apply hierarchical forecasting. So as I said, it combines the best of both forecasting situations. So at the high level, it will be easier to capture the trend and the seasonality that is in the product group. And then with your low level forecast, you will actually use this to break down the high level forecasts. So this will capture trends that are in your data or in your product group. For example, you just introduced a new product which has an increasing demand pattern, and it's taking market share of the old product. Then generally the low level forecast will be an increasing trend for the new product, a decreasing trend for the old product, and maybe the overall market trend is flat to slightly increasing. So then this flat to slightly increasing demand pattern, it will be broken down according to the forecast on the lower level. The second step here then is is forecast method optimization. And basically it answers the question, which forecast method to use. We're not going to talk specifically about one single forecasting method, but forecasting methods, they can generally be divided into 3 groups. First one is naive, so that's the very simple group. And a naive forecast method will just repeat the last observation or the last seasonal observation, depending on which naive method you use. The second method, or the second group, is the traditional statistical methods, and those are methods such as hold winters, exponential smoothing, ARIMA, ETS, and so on, which still rely on statistics and mostly use internal data or extrapolations actually of past trends and seasonality to create the forecasts. And then the third group is the usage of artificial intelligence, neural networks, gradient boosting, and what have you. And they generally they are able to forecast your demand using nonlinear, or they forecast nonlinear interactions. And it's also with these methods, it's easy, or you can take into account external data, such as maybe leading macroeconomic indicators. Of course, there's a difference in between all the three groups. And the first one is understandability. Well, of course, the two first groups, the very simple group and the traditional statistical group, it's generally easy to see why a forecast is being that forecast. For the third group, the artificial intelligence group, sometimes it's quite difficult to see why your method is saying this or this specific forecast. That's then more related to being a black box. If a forecaster doesn't understand why the forecast is like this, then yeah, it's quite difficult to see what is actually going wrong. The third or the second thing that you should take into account is overfitting. Generally, the first two methods, they are not very prone to overfitting. You can overfit using traditional statistical forecasting, but it can be taken into account quite easily. With artificial intelligence methods, you have to really watch out that you're not overfitting. To get back to the example with leading indicators, if you feed 100 leading indicators to your forecast method, it's possible, if you don't have a good implementation, that the forecast model uses the 100 indicators to produce the forecast methods, and this is not necessarily then, of course, the best method. So that's also a real issue with such kind of techniques. The third one is also, again, insights. So artificial intelligence methods that take into account external data. Well, that's can also lead to a lot of insights if applied well. And generally, those insights are what is driving your sales. So that's really interesting to know. And then the fourth thing to take into account, especially if you're doubting between the three techniques or the three groups, it's what is the forecast accuracy? So how well is the method able to forecast future observations? The second one is stability and robustness. How much does the forecast fluctuate in time? It's not very convenient for supply chain if you right now you forecast a huge increase, but then a couple of months later you forecast a huge decrease. That creates a bullwhip for the supply chain. And that's also something, well, the forecast accuracy is also something that you should take into account in different lags, and also take into account which lags are essential for you. So what do we mean by this? Well, if it's very difficult, or if your order book starts filling up 3 months in the future, then for example, for you it might be most important to have a good forecast accuracy 3 to 6 months in the future, because then you can still anticipate on things that are about to happen. And of course, the forecast method that you should pick, it also depends on the segments. So, for example, if you have a very well forecastable segment, then it might be good to use a more advanced technique such as the traditional statistical methods or artificial intelligence. Yeah, that's what I want to say. This is some levels that we with the Arqiva team have decided on. So generally the low level, these are time series that are a lot more nervous, whereas the high level, that's a lot more stable. So this is a lot of forecast techniques on one slide, but I think the key takeaway here is, well, if it's very nervous, then a good technique to use is a moving average method that will just take a moving average of the last 3 or 6 months. Whereas for a high-level technique, you're more going to use techniques that can take into account trend and seasonality, such as there's Solventure, Lewandowski method, and so on. A third tip is adding leading or external insights to your forecast process. For this, we as Solventure have made a tool that can take into account this. It's based on PhD research, which is also based on my PhD. And what we try to do with Live is we try to include the external data that you can have or that is available somewhere on the internet into your sales forecasts. So which types of data can we take into account? Well, we are very specialized in taking into account this macroeconomic data. We also have experience in forecasting using weather and using events, and of course calendar effects like seasonality, but also fluctuating holidays, Easter, and for example Ramadan. They are calendar effects, but they do not happen every year on the same date. So that's generally more difficult to take into account. And what is usually the outcome when you do a leading indicator project? Well, we generally see with our customers that using these leading indicators, you get actually an improved accuracy percentage. And also the usage of such indicators leads to insights in what is actually driving your business. Later I will show a demo on how to make it more representative for you. And in order to do this, we actually gathered a gigantic database with data from various statistical agencies such as the FRED and the National Bureau of Statistics. But you can also upload your own data into the tool. The final step is the implementation and the review of the results. First thing that you should really do is you should do a forecast lag analysis. And this is actually, you want to quantify how good your forecast is at every time period. So that's one of the things that you can see then is how fast does your forecast accuracy deteriorate in time. Second thing is the forecast value add analysis, where you can see, okay, over my previous situation, how much is my new situation improving and on which lag. Also, what's interesting is, okay, if I do collaborative forecasting or if I use sales inputs in my forecast process, does this add value? Generally, we see that this does add value, especially on the short horizons, whereas in the long horizons, sometimes salespeople, they are not well attentive or they do not care as much or do not have as much knowledge, for example, 6 months out. And the third step is to align KPIs with metrics. So we make sure, okay, if you use your reporting, does this align with your KPIs? And also a very specific point that I still wanted to make is, if you do your forecast, this should not be driven by what you want to reach that year, because the forecast should be of the demand and it should be independent. This should actually be a representation how well your targets for the next year will be. So what are the learnings here about what I showed you today? So first, preparation is key. So techniques like outlier detection and the 4-4-5 method for aggregation, they will improve the quality of your data and will result in a better forecast. Second, performing segmentation on the demand pattern and applying statistical methods according to those segmentation exercises can also improve forecast accuracy. The third thing that can improve forecast accuracy is including external information such as leading macroeconomic indicators. The fourth thing is get people involved. So The forecast can be improved by using the input of sales, finance, and market intelligence. But of course, those people, they will need training, because if you involve people who are not well trained, then this will not lead to the most optimal results. So now I will give the word back to Deborah.
Thank you, Gillian, for the elaboration on some tips and tricks in forecasting. I hope they've also been insightful for you. Let's see what we can do or what possible next steps can be for you to improve your forecast accuracy, and how Solventure might help with that. So with Solventure, we're having 2 programs which can tap into optimizing your forecast accuracy. One is a forecast accuracy improvement project, where we have a look at how your forecasting process is today. So how are you doing the forecast process? How is the demand planning meeting set up? Who's involved? So we can give you advice and coaching in setting up that process, basically. Now, also to really make some improvements, you also need to crunch your data, see what is the current situation, and set up some targets for improvement. And that is also some operational support where we can help you with. We've been talking about the Solventure Academy, and next week there is actually a training session on demand planning. So this will be held by the Solventure Academy in Belgium. If you would be interested, you can always reach out after the webinar to get some more information. On the other hand, you now saw a small demonstration of the leading indicator forecasting module, where we do use some techniques that include external factors, and that can help build a stable long-term forecast. If you would like to, try and test this forecasting model on your own data, then we have some good news. There are some free trials that you can apply for, and it's a short program where you can upload your own data and make a forecast model and see what the impact could be of using leading indicators. It's a very quick and easy program where we together with you go and look for which are good time series to analyze. We can help you find some right indicators that can help predict your demand and make a forecast model like that. And the results should be an improved accuracy, more insights on what is driving the demand. And if you use a planning tool, because the leading indicator forecasting is more done on an aggregated level, an advanced planning tool can disaggregate to lower levels of detail. It's also used to forecast less conventional data sets, so it's not just for demand planning, but for example, also forecasting the cost of goods sold, market demand, financial metrics, etc. So if you would be interested in that, also feel free to reach out after the webinar. Now, I want to thank you for joining today, and we promised also to keep some time for questions. Let's see if you have some question for us, and I would like to reserve also a little bit of time in the end to get your answers on our poll. So if you have some questions, you can use the question pane on the webinar screen and enter your question there. So one question that I already see here is, I know you have not talked about metrics, but what are good metrics to use in the demand planning? Should you use MAPI or bias? Are those good types of metrics to use? Gillian, would you have some information on that?
Yes. So generally, I would advise to use at least one accuracy metric. So the person here mentions MAPI. MAPI is generally a really good metric. Other used metrics can be, for example, the root mean squared error. And then you will, the difference between the MAPI and the root mean squared error is that you will penalize big fluctuations more by using the mean squared error. Because of course, if you take a square of something larger, then it will be larger, so it will penalize it more. And those accuracy measurements, they will generally tell you something about how well or how wrong your next forecast is going to be. Bias, on the other hand, will give you an indication. So that's, for example, the mean error or the mean percentage of error. And this will give you an indication of how much you will over or under forecast in the future. So I would advise to check both, or at least one metric for both types, for both accuracy and for bias.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. There are more questions coming in here. Another question that I see popping up here is, Gillian, you talked about having the bias, or if you use more advanced methods like leading indicator forecasting or other neural networks, overfitting is sometimes a risk. Here the question is, how do you prevent overfitting with leading indicator forecasting?
Well, we use actually we use a multi-step approach for this. So what we do is, when we start a trial or a project, then we ask the customer to list what he thinks that is what is driving the sales or his sales. And in the meanwhile, we do, behind the screens, we do a correlation analysis. And this is the first step. So we put the results of those two analyses together. This already reduces the data set from the 10 million plus indicators to, say, something around 100 indicators. So then it's also more manageable for the algorithms that are behind it. And then in the second step is to use forecast methods that are less prone to overfitting. So that's the second step. And then also the third step actually is validation with the customer. So generally when we do a project, it's not that we say, okay, here, that's the forecast model. What we really want is that it's understood and used by the customer. So that's why usually this takes 2 or maybe sometimes 3 rounds to finalize the model, let's say, so that it's that the customer agrees with it, understands it, and uses it.
Okay, so I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank Gillian for your explanation. If you have further questions, please let us know. And for the ones that the questions are not answered, which you post during the webinar, we will get in touch with you afterwards. Thank you and see you next time. Bye-bye.